Hello, we are here today to talk to you about supporting the reading and language development of English learners. My name is Carlin Conner, and I'm here with my colleagues Emily Solari, Isabel Vargas, and Karen Kehoe. And we are going to start it off with Emily Solari.
Hi, thanks, Carlin. So basically what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about English learners and their reading development and why and how English learners are at risk for reading difficulties and the interaction between reading difficulties and reading disabilities in English learner populations. First, we're going to start talking a little bit about English learners. Who are they and where do they live and what is the percentage of population across the proportion of the population across the country? So we know that ELs represent about 10% of the K-12 population in the United States. And clearly, as you can tell from the map, that this really varies depending on where you are. In California and Texas have large proportions of English learners. In places like we're at University of Virginia, only about 9% of the population in Virginia is in English or English learners. However, this population is growing across the country. We also know that about 75% of English learners in the US speak Spanish. So the overwhelming majority of English learners speak Spanish. However, there are many, many other languages that are spoken in the schools. The most of the research on English learners has been done in Spanish-speaking populations, with some done with Chinese-speaking populations, but the overwhelming majority of what we know about how English learners develop in reading is with Spanish-speaking populations. We know that the population of English learners is growing across the country, and it's growing in some places that we haven't seen such growth over the past 20 years. It's estimated that by 2030, ELs will make up about 40% of the school-age population across the country. So we're start to talk a little bit about reading performance disparities with English learners. And we're going to go through a couple of key takeaways and just to build some background knowledge about what does the data tell us about how English learners develop reading. We know that there are discrepancies or disparities between sort of these broad assessments of reading development between monolingual English speakers and their EL peers. And we also know that there are results from a variety of different things that are going on, including societal, economic, and educational factors. I'm going to briefly go through the most recent NAEP data for 4th, 8th, and 12th grade, just to show that there is a discrepancy between English learners and their non-English learner peers. And, important to remember that the NAEP assessments are just one assessment of reading. They're not the end-all be-all of reading, but they are a proxy for literacy and literacy development and scores across the country. And so it's not something we should ignore, that there are sort of these gaps between English learners and their non-English learner peers. So this is the 4th grade data. This is the 8th grade data from 2019 and the 12th grade data. A few things to note: that the discrepancies between English learners and non-English learners grow over time. So between 4th, 8th, and 12th grade, those discrepancies get wider. And another thing to notice is that the discrepancies have been persistent across years. So these data show you from 2002 to 2019, and there hasn't been a decrease in the gap between English learners and their non-English learner peers in reading scores across that time. So why do these disparities exist? We want to be really clear that it's not due to inherent differences in children. So it's not about individual differences that are happening within children. They're more related to societal and educational opportunities. We also know that English learners have disproportionate rates of poverty, especially for those who have parents who are born outside the United States. Across the country, this is different from state to state, but in most states, English is the dominant language of instruction. So when our English learners arrive in kindergarten and maybe they do not speak English, they are being instructed in English. And so they have to sort of catch up. They're building both their language skills and their reading skills at the same time. We also know across the country that there's an insufficient application of science of reading principles to instruction. And what that means is that there is a lack of evidence-based practice in our general education classrooms across the country about how related to the most effective and efficient way to teach early reading skills. And we also know that there's an over and under identification of ELs in special education, and the trends tend to show that in the early years, so kindergarten through second or third grade, English learners are under-identified as having, for example, a reading disability, and then they tend to be over-identified in the later grades. A little bit more on poverty here. We know that 93% of Latino children are born in the United States, and that 1/3 of the Hispanic population lives in poverty. And this is dependent upon whether or not their parents were born in the United States or not. But really the important piece here is that a large proportion of this population is living in poverty in the United States. So a little bit about reading development and what it means for English learners. English learners, like English monolinguals, have to develop both proficient word reading or decoding and also linguistic comprehension to be successful readers. Linguistic comprehension, often also referred to as listening comprehension. The simple view of reading shows us that both decoding or word reading and linguistic comprehension both of these things are really important for reading comprehension. The simple view of reading has been empirically validated by hundreds of studies, including studies that include English learners in their population. And it really shows that over time, the proportion that both decoding and linguistic comprehension predict reading comprehension outcomes. However, we also know that this sort of the impact of both listening comprehension and decoding may look a little different when compared to English monolingual peers, such that the importance of the development of oral language or listening comprehension or linguistic comprehension is particularly important for our English learners. Simple view of reading should not be considered, it's called simple, but it's not simplistic. And basically we're just showing you this slide to indicate that under decoding and linguistic comprehension, there are several subcomponent skills that are really necessary for successful reading development. And when you break it down this way, you can see that the targets of instruction. So we know that phonological awareness and phonemic awareness is really important for developing word reading. We know alphabet knowledge is important in orthography. And under linguistic comprehension, we know that semantics and vocabulary, morphology, and syntax are all really important for developing that listening comprehension or linguistic comprehension. And we know that this is true for English monolingual children and also English learners. In more recent years, there have been studies that look at the input of reading fluency on reading comprehension. It has sort of evolved our understanding of how successful reading comprehension happens. So we just, in this slide, we're just sort of showing that there is an interaction between, we had to make sure that we're developing decoding, linguistic comprehension, and fluency, and all of those things are related to reading comprehension. Importantly, just very quickly to point out that reading comprehension is the goal of reading. When we talk about early reading, word reading development, we know that kids have to be able to decode words in order to comprehend what they're reading, but reading single words or reading connected text is not the end goal of reading. We want them to be able to engage in complex text and understand what they're reading or have reading comprehension. Okay, so now I'm going to turn this over to Isabel, who's going to go a little bit more deeply into what we know about English learners' reading development.
Thank you, Dr. Solari. So the first thing that I want to highlight in terms of what we know about English learners' reading development is something that Dr. Solari already touched on a little bit, is that first we know that the simple view of reading also applies to English learners. So both decoding and linguistic comprehension contribute separately to English learners' reading skills. And we know that skilled readers typically have strong decoding as well as strong linguistic comprehension. And in contrast, poorer readers have a weakness in one or both of these components. And this is very important in terms of practical implications for reading instruction for English learners, in that English learners must develop proficiency in both aspects of the simple view. So they need to develop proficiency in both word reading and linguistic comprehension in order to become successful readers. Additionally, research has also shown that there are some differences in the way the simple view of reading explains reading comprehension for English learners relative to their English monolingual peers. And as Dr. Solari mentioned, one of these examples is the contribution of linguistic comprehension to text comprehension, especially in the upper elementary grades and beyond. So as text becomes a little more complex in the upper elementary grades, there are differences in the relative contributions to word reading and linguistic comprehension. And on average, vocabulary and other linguistic comprehension variables make up a larger contribution towards the reading comprehension for all students as they progress, but this is especially true for English learners. And this suggests that it's very important to support English learners' development of linguistic comprehension skills to support reading comprehension overall for more complex academic tasks and texts that they will encounter during upper elementary and middle school and beyond. So the second key aspect we want to highlight about English learners' reading development is that we also know that the same early indicators of reading risk predict later reading performance for English learners and their English monolingual peers. So this by itself has also important implications, and that it's imperative that schools provide early interventions for English learners in the same way that they provide interventions for English monolingual students, rather than waiting to see if these English learners catch up as they gain more exposure to the language of instruction. So additionally, this highlights the need for teachers to assess and monitor all of the students' linguistic comprehension, and when appropriate, provide additional instruction in this domain. So information about an English learner's first language in their vocabulary knowledge in kindergarten or first grade can be useful, and as knowing this information can be helpful for teachers as they plan later on their intervention. And it's equally important to assess and monitor students' knowledge and skills that are foundational to word reading as well, as research has shown that the dominant predictor of word reading for both English learners and English monolingual peers is phonological awareness. So early phonological awareness in an English learner's native language is a strong predictor of their later English reading achievement overall. And this suggests that teachers can administer early assessment in phonological awareness and vocabulary in an English learner's first language to enable them to intervene earlier to address any difficulties that exist and reduce risk for later reading difficulties in the future. And then lastly, we want to highlight that we know that early intervention research shows that English learners can achieve the same level in word reading as their English monolingual peers when they receive evidence-based instruction that is aligned with the science of reading. So this means that English learners, like other students, need explicit and systematic interventions that include instruction in both phonological awareness and word reading, as well as promotes linguistic comprehension, such as vocabulary development. So now we're going to talk about supporting the reading achievement for all English learners. And one of the key takeaways we have is that English learners are inconsistently and inadequately screened for reading difficulties, leading to both the over and under identification of English learners in special education. So how are English learners represented in special education? So here you can see the percentage distribution of students ages 3 to 21 that were served under IDEA by disability type in the 2018-2019 school year. And in this school year, about 7.1 million students were served, and the large majority were under the specific learning disability category. Now, here you can see how L's are proportioned in these different categories. So there are debates on whether L's are disproportionately represented in special education in each of the different disability categories. And on the official Department of Education website, it states that L's with disabilities were more likely to be classified as having either a specific learning disability or speech language impairment. And they state that although Ls make up 10% of the total students with disabilities, 14% of Ls were students with disabilities compared to 13% of Ls for the overall student population. And among the Ls with disabilities, nearly 50% were categorized as having a specific learning disability. And similarly, 21% of Ls with disabilities were identified as having a speech or language impairment. So we want to go over some of the factors that influence special education placement in the English learner population. And the first factor was grade level. So as Dr. Solari mentioned a little earlier, English learners in kindergarten and first grade are typically underrepresented in special education, while they tend to be overrepresented in third grade and above in all disability categories. The next factor that influences special education placement for English learners is language proficiency. And data suggests that English learners with limited proficiency in both their first and second languages have the highest placement in special education. So Ls with a limited L1 and L2 were 3 times more likely to be labeled as having a language and speech impairment, and over 4 times more likely to be designated as having a specific learning disability. As I just previously mentioned, the disability category influences special education placement, as well as school resources and school demographics. So English learners are more likely to be identified as having a disability in schools that have higher levels of academic achievement, schools that have more resources, and schools that have a lower minority student enrollment. So that is to say that English learners are less likely to be identified as having a disability in schools with lower rates of academic achievement, less access to resources, and have higher minority student enrollment. Next, the other additional factors that influence special education placement in the English learner population also includes assessment instruments. So previous research has found that the assessment tools used to determine special education eligibility may be inappropriate for English learners. And this data suggests that these tools might be misleading and may cause the disproportionate representation of Ls in special education. So some factors in English assessments that can cause this low validity and reliability when measuring English learners' achievement includes long phrases, unfamiliar words, complex sentences. Although there are additional assessments that are now normed with diverse populations, including English learners, schools have to be sure that they're using these new valid and reliable assessments. Another factor is teacher preparation. So teacher preparation research has found that teacher preparation in most states is not a requirement for pre-service teachers, and they do not actually have to take an extensive coursework in how to teach English learners. And teachers who lack professional knowledge may fail to account for how students' previous educational experiences impact their learning. And teachers without an adequate professional knowledge of how to teach English learners may provide this population of students with inappropriate literacy instruction and may postpone referring English learners to special education testing as they are waiting for them to catch up based on their limited proficiency in English. Additionally, state, district, and school policies also influence special education placement for the English learner population. And these policies influence the professional development offered to educators, they impact the type of personnel hired, and they influence the allocation of funds to support services and resources available to teachers and students. So additionally, a school and district's policies can fail to guide teachers on how to make referral decisions. They may fail to ensure that assessments are non-discriminatory. They influence the type of personnel that are available to teachers to help interpret student assessment outcomes and data. And policies also help determine how to interpret this data, as well as how to rule out other causes of failure that might be able to be attributed to it. And lastly, teacher attitudes and beliefs can influence special education placement. With that, while some teachers do have a positive and welcoming and asset mindset towards English learners, others may not, and this can impact the overall referral rate for English learners to special education.
Thank you, Isabel. So Carlin Conner here again. I am going to go through some strategies to support the reading and language development of English learners in your classrooms. I am a former special education teacher. I taught elementary special education primarily to English language learners. And these strategies are things that I've used in my classroom and have been found to be supportive in developing and promoting the reading and language of students who are English learners. One of the key takeaways for this section for you all to remember is that English learners need evidence-based literacy instruction. Instruction that has been found to be beneficial for all students is also beneficial for our English language learners, but they also might need some added supports to develop English language proficiency along the way. It's important to remember that it takes about 1 to 3 years for students to develop basic interpersonal communication skills and about 5 to 7 years to develop cognitive academic language proficiency. So you need to remember that just because a student has basic interpersonal communication skills, they might seem proficient in English and can talk to you and keep up socially. That doesn't necessarily mean that that student has had the time to develop academic language proficiency yet. So we still need to provide lots of practice so students can develop and use academic language across all content areas. Again, the research says that what's generally effective for all students is also effective for students who are English language learners. They just might require some additional instructional supports. You can use the home language to promote academic development in your classroom. Even if you are teaching in English, you can incorporate the student's home language to help promote English language development, academic language development. And I'm going to go through some strategies to incorporate the home language in a few minutes. Bilingual or English language learners require early and many opportunities to develop English proficiency, especially specific to content areas. And there's a need for teachers to develop pedagogical language knowledge as part of their disciplines. And this means that teachers really need to understand what language requirements are necessary for students to see success in their content areas and make sure that you're providing your English learners practice using those necessary language. Some instructional recommendations for English learners are to make sure you are teaching academic vocabulary, specifically going through academic vocabulary that students will need to access that material and explicitly teaching that to your English learners. Make sure you're integrating plenty of opportunity for oral and written language practice across the content areas. And this will look like many regular structured opportunities to develop written language skills. You can also do this through small group instructional interventions with your students who are maybe struggling in literacy or their English development. And it's important to remember this simple view here that Dr. Solari talked to you about in the beginning. And you really need to make sure that you are targeting what a student specifically needs. So if they're struggling with word level reading difficulty, make sure you're targeting their reading difficulty. But if they're struggling with their language proficiency, make sure that that's the area that you're targeting. Instructional supports that have been found to be beneficial for English learners include building on the student's prior experiences. So this looks like culturally responsive practices in your classrooms. Make sure that you are purposeful about incorporating experiences from the student's culture so that they can relate to the material in your class. Make sure you're providing students with the necessary background knowledge to access your material because they might not have that background knowledge that we assume that they have. You can use lots of graphic organizers, pictures, demonstrations, real life objects, visuals. Any sort of inquiry-based instruction will also be helpful for the English learners in your classroom. Make sure to allow additional practice time and be purposeful about setting language and content objectives for your lessons so that students have the necessary knowledge to access that material. You can use sentence frames or models. These have been found to be helpful for English learners, and make sure that you're differentiating your instruction by language proficiency. Again, you can use a student's native language to promote academic development. So teaching your academic content in 2 languages would really help a student to become literate in both languages. So if you can incorporate any sort of information in the home language of the student, that will be helpful for encouraging their English development as well. You can use cognates if there are bilingual teacher aids, or bilingual teachers in your schools, you can try to have them help you identify some of those cognates. And we have some resources for you at the end of this slide regarding those. You can encourage parents to speak the student's home language with them to incorporate their first language development, and make sure in your classroom you're promoting the use of any sort of bilingual or multilingual materials. Linguistically responsive teaching looks like respecting and having a positive attitude towards linguistic diversity in your classroom. Make sure that you're learning about the backgrounds of your students so that you can advocate for them and identify any language demands. It's important to remember that English proficiency is not part of the definition of giftedness. So these are some specific strategies and activities for building vocabulary and fluency with your students. And these activities are not just for younger elementary students, but you can use all of these with older students in their specific content areas to help build academic knowledge as well, academic content vocabulary as well. So model talk looks like physically demonstrating the directions or concepts involved in a lesson that might be more abstract to a student using gestures, props, any sort of visual or voice modification to help provide students a context for learning about abstract concepts in a way that they can understand. Vocabulary role play can be very similar, and this involves students creating skits to demonstrate the meaning of new academic vocabulary, new words or concepts, can help students make existing connections to their background knowledge to help them access academic vocabulary, and they can demonstrate the application of words in different contexts. And it provides students with an opportunity to discuss new words with each other. Word walls are not just for younger elementary students. These can be active spaces within your classroom, or students can have personal word walls using folders. And this can be great for academic vocabulary with some of your older students. You can have students place new words as they're learning them into their appropriate area on the word wall and just give themselves clues to understand those words. These clues can be in the student's first language, or you can have visual clues to help students access and practice that academic vocabulary. Scripting would be an activity where students can use sample language interactions and develop scripts for different situations. So this is appropriate for beginning students who are just building social English, or more advanced students who are building a sociocultural competence. And make sure that if you're using an activity like scripting where students are working together to create an example interaction, that you're building a space for culturally appropriate language in a safe environment. And make sure you're allowing interactions for students who have varying levels of language proficiency. We don't always need to group students with students of similar abilities. GIST stands for generating interaction between schemata and text. And in this activity, it just stands for getting the main idea. So in this activity, you would have the students separate a text into individual pieces. Each student would have the opportunity to have a silent reading period to read their individual piece and come up with a one-sentence written or oral summary of what they read. They would then work as a group to collaboratively come up with a one-sentence summary of each portion of the text. And this will provide an opportunity for students to discuss text with each other using language, and will also help to reinforce summarizing skills. Syntax surgery is a great activity to help students with language comprehension, but in this activity, this teacher would write a sentence on a strip, cut the strip into clauses or separate words, and the students would have the opportunity to manipulate the pieces and create complete sentences. So students are physically manipulating language and get to really see and experience and practice the importance of syntax in developing word meaning and sentence meaning. Close activities involve the students filling in blanks in the text. So a teacher would create or find a text and then remove specific words or phrases and have the students fill in those words or phrases. You can have adaptation based on the needs of students, depending on which words you remove. And again, this can help practice language comprehension through shades of meaning, as there are multiple words that can sometimes be appropriate for a blank. And you can also use this strategy to assess reading comprehension strategies. It's really important overall to make sure you are providing your English learners ample opportunities to practice English, both social and academic English, through both oral and written opportunities. Make sure you're building on your students' backgrounds and you're mixing your English learners with native English speakers. And it's important to continue to engage students' families and communities in their academic development. To support the pedagogical language knowledge of your students, it's important for you as a teacher to really get to know your content knowledge. Understand what words are integrally tied to the content areas and what words students need to know competently to access your material. And make sure you are providing lots of opportunities to practice for students to practice using that language in different contexts. Remember to continue to support and engage your English learners in meaningful and challenging tasks. So one of the key takeaways here is that, here we go. Sorry, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Karen. Karen.
Thanks, Carlin. Can you see me? Okay, good. Sorry. Thank you. So yeah, the strategies that Carlin just shared with you are really excellent ways to apply the principles of supporting English learners' language and literacy development that she spoke about and that Dr. Solari and Isabel spoke about. But what we really want to remember is that that's just one side of that simple view, right? The language comprehension strand. But we don't want to neglect the other side of the simple view, which of course is the word reading. And it is important to remember those foundational skills that support students' accurate and automatic word reading. And those are the foundational skills or the subcomponent skills that Dr. Solari spoke about, which are phonological and phonemic awareness, alphabetic principle, letter sound relationships, phonic decoding, and spelling, right? So while you're supporting the language development of your English learners, really pay attention to these foundational skills that children need, not just English learners, but English monolingual students need to be able to read words accurately and automatically. So some examples, and one thing I did want to say actually on the simple view is that we are starting to find that although we want to support students' foundational skills and their oral language, we want to be able to have interventions that actually integrate both of those strands. Those interventions tend to be more effective than interventions that just focus on one strand alone. So this next slide just shows some examples of differences between Spanish and English phonemes. And the reason that we're showing you these is that it's important to be aware of these as you're assessing English learners' foundational skills, especially their phonological awareness. And again, this is just for Spanish-speaking English learners because they do make up the majority of the English learner population. But you want to, depending on the first language of the students that you are teaching, you want to be aware of some of the difficulties that they may be experiencing pronouncing words in English given their native language. And so these can really be important to be aware of, especially as you're assessing students. Here are some other sounds that can be difficult for English language learners whose native language is not Spanish. And you'll have a copy of this after the presentation. And so how do we get at whether or not our English learners are struggling not just with oral language development, but with that word reading side of the simple view? And so here again, and all of my colleagues have said this, but just to reiterate it, we need to keep in mind that simple view. All students, English learners and English monolinguals, and those with reading disabilities and difficulties require proficiency in both sides of that simple view, in both word reading and linguistic comprehension. And so it is important to assess their skills on both sides of the strand, or excuse me, on both strands of the simple view. So assess to instruct. So again, it is vital that we have sensitive measures Isabel spoke about the need for valid measures for English learners. We need sensitive, standardized measures of reading and phonological skills so that we can understand, for our English learners who are struggling with reading, we can understand the precise nature and severity of their early reading problems. So we don't just want to attribute it to the fact that they're learning English. They may also have a phonological deficit that can be impeding their word reading abilities. And then we use that information from our assessments to tailor our instruction and our intervention to support the individual needs of students. And this is really important at the earliest opportunity. As teachers, you've heard probably over and over again that, you know, prevention is much more effective than remediation. So we have two main uses for educational assessment. We have formative and summative. And when we think of formative, if you're like me, you tend to get these terms kind of confused sometimes. When you think of formative, you want to think of how are we doing, right? These are assessments collected throughout the school year that you use in real time to inform and adjust your instruction. And then summative is sort of that reflection, that looking back, how did we do? So these are assessments that are collected at the end of the year or at the end of a unit of study that tells you how did students make progress toward mastering the content that you wanted to teach. And so these will not necessarily allow you to make those real-time adjustments to instruction, but they are also important so that you can sort of evaluate the effectiveness of the instruction for the students in your class. We have formal and informal assessments. As educators, you're all very well aware of these. A formal assessments, again, can be those standardized assessments. You have standard administration procedures. You have carefully prescribed scoring procedures, and you need to make sure that you adhere to those procedures or your scores may be invalid. And the goal is to be completely objective so that you can compare students' performance against a standard. Whereas the informal assessments, really you have discretion in how you want to use these. And the goal here really is to be able to be subjective and to think about what an individual child needs. And so that you can, again, adjust your instruction, see if the child needs more intensive support or a different kind of support. If you want to think about mastery measurement versus continuous progress monitoring, that mastery measurement kind of again goes toward that more formal side, where the summative assessments, you have end of unit tests, skill benchmark tests. These are really, again, evaluating whether or not a student mastered the content. Whereas the continuous progress monitoring really helps you to assess students in real time and see if they are making the progress that you expect them to be making versus comparing them to an objective standard. You can administer assessments either in a group setting or an individual setting. There are disadvantages and advantages to each, but just in the context of English learners, it's important to think about your needs for the assessment and what you kind of hope to get out of it. So you could administer a group assessment to multiple children simultaneously, and this can be sort of to determine the performance of a school, a district, or a state relatively quickly, but it may not be super helpful for an individual child. And so if you really want to say, okay, how is my English learner, how is an individual English learner in my classroom performing and monitoring that individual's progress, it's probably better to do an individual administration of an assessment. And usually you're going to require the child to respond orally. And so especially when you're talking about foundational skills and word reading, it is important to think about some of the responses that you may expect to hear. So those phonemes that can be confused in different languages is important to have in mind. We have some examples of, again, just Spanish progress monitoring assessments that have been validated and are reliable. And if you are familiar with the English versions, we kind of put them in smaller text underneath. We are not necessarily advocating for any of these assessments. These are just some examples. And you may not have discretion about what you're able to use at your school, but these are things to be aware of that can help you to monitor the progress of your English learners learners who speak Spanish as a native language if you're looking for them. So if you're looking for phonological processing and those foundational skills, the Spanish version of the CTOP can be helpful, which is the TOPS, or the test of phonological processing in Spanish. DIBELS, which many of us are familiar with, can also assess. There's also a Spanish version to help you assess those foundational skills. And then if you're looking to assess oral reading fluency in Spanish, there's an Ames Web Spanish reading CBM, or curriculum-based measure. So just some examples, and there are others, but these are ones that we wanted to show you that have been validated and are reliable. So taking that assessment information, again, we're kind of thinking about the formative assessments here, and the use of those assessments to guide your instruction and to guide your support for your English learners. You have accommodations and you have modifications. And so both can be helpful to facilitate student learning, and you just have to be really thoughtful about which one or a combination that you use to support your English learners. So for accommodations, you want to think about the smiley face being your student, and the star being that goal, right, of what you want the student to learn. And so when you implement accommodations for the student, you're really scaffolding. So these, you can think of these as sort of like stepping stones to help that student get to where you want them to be. Whereas when you modify, you're taking that goal and you're not necessarily you're not lowering your standards, but you're just kind of shifting it. So that you're not necessarily scaffolding the student to get there, you're just shifting what you're expecting the student to do. So here are some examples of some accommodations versus modifications, and you all can read, so I'll just keep this up for a moment so you can digest this. And then you see some examples at the bottom. So examples of accommodations being separate testing location, extra time, student doesn't have to bubble in the answers. And then an example of a modification would be an entirely different text, right? Or testing on fewer or different objectives. So here are some common modifications and accommodations and modifications that you can use for English learners. And we have some resources sort of here at the end that you can access when you're planning lessons and preparing for instruction with ELS, keeping in mind the principles that my colleagues and I spoke about today. So you have Ethnologue, which gives you different country index with maps, with language names and codes spoken in those countries. Here are some examples of the maps. And so you can just explore that when you have some time. And then at the end, we have some resources to share with you. So we wanted to thank you for your time. And I think we're going to have a question and answer session. So thank you very much.